You're listening to the Back Home Network, presented by Homefield Apparel.
Welcome back to CrimsonCast. Galen Clavia, Scott Caulfield back with you together again here on the show as we are less than a week away from the college football season starting for Indiana. The college football season already started for a few other teams, and we got some immediate entertainment out of it as Florida State loses in Ireland to Georgia Tech. And there'll be much more of that where I think everything is coming from in this season. Could be kind of a crazy one. We are excited to talk IU football. We are going to start settling into our normal podcast pattern. For those of you who are new to the show, that means we'll be doing a show pretty much every Sunday following a game or preceding a game from this point forward until the end of the year, which hopefully won't end until like January. But Scott, we've been doing this for a while. It's always fun to fire it back up again, and I'm looking forward to working with you for another season. I'm going to zoom in here on YouTube so everybody can see us in full makeup. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Yeah, ready to have the Sundays taken over. Sunday mornings with coffee. It's good mornings, good football, and hopefully we'll talk about the whole season. I think we're going to have more good podcasts than bad is the hope.
That's always the hope. Yes, we are going to have a lot to talk about, especially this year. You don't know how the year is going to go for a variety of reasons. We've got some hope, which is always nice to have. Certainly feel like we're in a much different spot than we were last year at this same time, when there was just really not a lot of optimism heading into the season for those of us that were paying attention to what was going on with the roster. And that, unfortunately, was borne out in terms of the way the season went. So we're going to talk about not so much a recap of the full off season, because we've already had a lot of those podcasts already. We are going to talk bigger picture items. We'll talk a little bit about some of the things that we've had on the network here over the course of the last week, which you may want to go check out if you're looking for more individual analysis of certain aspects of things. But this podcast really about getting our predictions down for the season and kind of talking about the general vibe of what we're facing going into the 2024 football campaign. Before we get to that, some business to get out of the way. First of all, just a reminder, we're part of the Back Home Network, which is a large, ever-growing community of podcasts that cover a variety of different things. Obviously, our friends at Assembly Call, who are covering men's basketball primarily, also some women's basketball. We've got the CrimsonCast women's basketball show. We've got the Doing the Work podcast, which also covers women's basketball. We've got a new podcast that debuted over the summer, if you haven't checked it out yet, on the women's basketball front. Austin Render taking us through conversations with a variety of people across the fine world of women's basketball, and several other shows on the Back Home Network, all of us brought to you by Homefield Apparel, your place to go for the finest in college fashions, the softest fabrics, the coolest designs. If you'd like to get 15% off your first order at Homefield Apparel, it's HOME23 is the code, HOME23 for first-time orders. And Homefield already rolling out new stuff throughout the course of this week of college football getting started. A bunch of new bomber jackets hitting the supply chain here and coming hopefully to your mailbox relatively soon, or your doorstep maybe. Maybe it's not actually getting delivered to your mailbox. But Homefield Apparel, your place to go for shirts, hats, a little bit of everything with college football across the board. You will find something that you love at homefieldapparel.com. Go check them out. Follow them on social media, homefieldapparel.com. Again, your place to go for the finest in college fashions. Also, just a reminder, we are on Substack. Head over to crimsoncast.substack.com, and you'll find all of the goodness of what we are producing. We'll email it out to you so that you don't have to rely on social media. We also have some VIP videos occasionally for those of you who go with the paid subscriber option to help support the podcast. Again, crimsoncast.substack.com. Almost 1,000 people in the Substack now, Scott. It's exciting, and watching that growth has been really cool. We hope to have you folks join as well. Let's go ahead and jump in as we talk about out of an overview of where we feel we're at going into the season. Scott, we've had some podcasts over the course of this past week. You had Zion Brown from WIUX on. You had Connor Onion from Big Ten Network and elsewhere. I talked with Taylor Lehman. So we've broken down some of the specific items for this team heading into the season. As we sit here 6 days before the opening kick, what is your overall vibe around this team, and how would you compare that to where you were at this time last year?
It's like it's like yin and yang, or like a black and white cookie in New York. Last year it was very dour. We were not happy. I think you and I got in the biggest fight we've gotten in a while on the podcast.
We had a bit of kind of a knockdown drag out after taping an episode. It was great.
Yeah, and I think it's more. It was the where we were all kind of mentally at. Just like an hour talking football is not going to end anybody's relationship in a good place. This is, partially why, big picture, not related to any certain coach, but this is why you change coaches.
Yeah.
As a program is nothing personal about Tom Allen. I'm just saying at a high level, this is why you do coaching change. And everyone's like, I don't know, you got to have stability. It's like, this is why you do it, because the results may be the same. Right. And, the players may all be the same level of play, but you just have you can kind of graft all your positive thoughts onto what's there versus what you kind of knew was going to be there. Yeah. We're hopefully in for a slightly better season than last year. But the main thing is just the optimism of a new coach. So, I mean, the feeling from last year to this year is completely night and day. I'm trying my best to kind of stay somewhat grounded to reality, but there's a lot of factors at play. You have a new coach who's shown the ability to be successful in a variety of areas. He's shown the ability to start off very quickly with success in all the spots that he's landed. When programs that he's been with have moved up, they've done well quickly. You have all that coupled with, as we've talked about on a lot of our previews, just a really soft schedule. That's something that I continue to go back to talking to friends about. Like, man, just wait, man, IU football, you shouldn't get that excited. It's like, well, their schedule is really easy. Like, right. Yes, all those things are true, but this is a schedule built to get you to a bowl. It's possibly built to get you to a 7 wins without maybe even beating anybody good. And there's nothing wrong with that. Like, that's a great place to be. So, we've seen IU fumble with really good scheduling opportunities before. So I'm not saying it's out of the realm of possibility, but there's a lot of hope, a lot of excitement. I think now is going to come that week of slight dread, is like, all right, because now the rubber hits the road. And like, what are we going to see against FIU? Are those things really going to happen? Or is it just going to be kind of the same old that you and I have seen for 30 plus years in IU football?
Yeah, I look at it like there's a couple of big overarching factors. First of all, I've always resisted, this if you've listened to the show long enough, folks, and Scott certainly knows it. Like in basketball and in football, really in any sport, I really do resist the idea that somehow there is an immovable programmatic reason why a school is bad at a sport.
Yeah, I hate to interrupt, but like if you're watching this on YouTube, like are you you docking a boat? Like you're tying all these knots down here. What is going on?
I realized when we started recording the show that my headset was irretrievably tangled in a bunch of patch cords that I use for other audio purposes up here in my studio.
First 10 minutes of getting the Christmas lights out, you're just like knot after knot after knot.
It's really bad. Like you can only imagine what it was like when I started, like to the point that I found another headset. Like who knew that was even there? So yeah, sorry folks. You've either been greatly entertained by this. This is another reason why video podcasting is actually superior to just doing straight audio, because you get those kind of visual aids. Thank you.
Galen, untangle cords. Sorry, I had to just after 20 minutes of watching you go through cords, I had to say something.
And now I'm done. I finished the whole pile. It's great. All right. Anyway,
what are we cleaning next? Cleaning with Galen. Where are we going to go? Are you going to cover?
Well, next we're actually going to assemble a Lego set. No, it's
that'd be great.
So there's two overarching things that I think are important to keep in mind with how to think about IU, because again, I think that there might have been an argument that just, so many of the problems IU football's had over the course of time have been a combination of a lack of logistical support and caring for football because of an emphasis or an overemphasis on basketball, or just kind of a lack of understanding about the culture of football from an administrative perspective. And that has led to coaches being hired that were not the right fits. And then, the whole thing kind of feeds on itself.
Right.
So I think from that perspective, there's a big thing that's changed. And you can argue that it hasn't changed. And I understand why you would argue that, because we haven't actually seen tangible results yet. But there is no question that IU, in my mind, has made a commitment to football from an administrative perspective that they never have before. And I would point in evidence to that the fact that we went into this podcast last year bummed about how bad the team was likely going to be, because we had already seen the script play out a couple of times already with Tom Allen. We knew that the roster was not there to get better. Tom Allen had another, he had time on his contract. It wasn't like it was a make or break year. IU did not need to fire Tom Allen for, they were well within their boundaries from a contractual perspective to say, look, we've got him for a couple more years. We're going to have to make do. And yet they chose to fire Tom Allen. And they did it quietly. They spent a lot of money on firing Tom Allen. Then they went out and hired a very hot coaching prospect in Curt Cignetti, a guy that was on the radar of other teams who were going to be in a similar boat. They moved quickly and decisively. They had him hired within a week of Allen getting fired, I believe. And then they went out and they have continued to spend large amounts of money in NIL, which has allowed them to attract a level of talent through the transfer portal that is surprising, given where this team was a year ago, and given how one of the big complaints was a lack of NIL investment from the previous staff. And so,
well, can I just one thing on that, and it's totally different times, but going back in history, when Kevin Wilson came here, there was definitely an air of, it felt like him pushing against the university, in the idea of him being like, hey, this is, I'm from Oklahoma. This is the way football should be. And, again, we're kind of just, these are the way stories went, but it's like, there would also be the push from the university being like, I don't know, we don't quite do it this way. It was definitely like a push and a pull. As you mentioned with Cignetti, this time, not only did they go out and get him, it does feel like they were like, all right, what do you need, Kurt? Like, what do you need? And we'll get that for you. Versus in previous times, it has felt like, the coach is the one pushing the university, and the university is kind of pushing back a little bit.
And look, I think it's important to remember that this is a space in time when IU and many other schools are having to make a decision about how are we going to conduct business moving forward.
Yeah.
And I think for IU, I think the realization has come. And look, I think there was support in the Tom Allen era that had been unmatched in previous generations. I mean, the amount of money that was spent on assistant coaches was as high as it has ever been. The amount of money spent on the head coach was as high as it had ever been. But you had an issue there where the money was being spent on a coaching staff and a head coach who I don't think were actually capable of sustaining at this level. And we saw that play out. And so it's like, then it's a matter of, well, the investment that has been made has to be continually made. You can't just say, well, it didn't work out this time, therefore we're not going to do it. But I think you're right. I mean, to me, IU has looked at the landscape and said, we don't have a choice. We have to be at least okay at football, occasionally competitive, which we've been talking about for a while. Like no one in the IU fan base is saying, why are we not Ohio State?
Right.
Most people are saying, why are we not
Maryland
or Minnesota or Michigan State? Like, why can't we be at that level where it's like, nobody's expecting 10 wins every year, but people would expect at least a 10-win season, which IU is one of 3 programs in college football history that doesn't have a 10-win season in its history. So
home field's not come out with a 10-win Indiana shirt anytime.
No, that would no, not yet. So when I look at all of that, I say to myself, okay, IU.
God, I never even thought about that. Is that true?
Yes, it is. And Iowa State is one of the other teams that's never won 10 games. There's a third team. I saw it on a graphic, and I cannot for the life of me remember who the third team is.
By the way, good name for our IU football podcast. Just like, is that true? God, is that true?
God, is that true?
IU football, because there's always these stats that come up, and you have that spreadsheet of like, the pain of IU football or whatever.
Indiana football history makes you cry. Thank you. Yes, that is
half the podcast. Is like, God, is that really true? Like, just there's stats like that. Anyway.
It is a staggering set of circumstances. places. I will find that third team by the time the podcast is over, and I will have it out to you. But anyway, my point being, there are programs, which some of whom Indiana will play this year, who do not appear to have jumped fully into the idea that you're going to have to spend money not just on coaching but on NIL. One of the early opponents for IU seems to be struggling with that from an NIL perspective in terms of they're not terribly competitive for transfers, and so I think IU you have to, in my opinion, until proven otherwise, you have to look at this and say, at least organizationally, this appears to be a different era for IU football than what we've seen in the past, and that is good. The other thing I think that has to be mentioned is that so much of football is marginal in that you have the teams that are clearly better than everybody else, clearly have more talent. The Ohio States, the Alabamas, there's several teams you'd throw in there, maybe Texas this year.
You hate it.
What?
Michigan,
Right. I mean, whatever. I actually don't know that Michigan is quite that talented this year, which is why I didn't put them in there. But my point being, you get below that top echelon of 7 or 8 teams who are clearly better than everybody else, and it may not even be that many. And you start to get into teams and opponents that are not completely insurmountable as long as you have a decent level of talent and a good coaching staff, or a good level of talent and a decent coaching staff. And this is where I think it's been frustrating for IU because, you look at taking the COVID year out, like the huge length of time it's been since IU beat Michigan or Ohio State or Penn State. And yet you've seen most other programs in the conference get at least one of those scalps, as you have called them before. It's felt like a bridge too far for IU. It does feel like the talent level has been raised and the coaching level has been raised with this IU team. And being in the conversation from a talent perspective with some of the other teams that are out there is all you need sometimes. And I will point to yesterday's game between Georgia Tech and Florida State as an example of this. Florida State was clearly overrated, but Georgia Tech was also clearly better than people gave them credit for in that particular game. They played a good game, got some breaks to go their way, overcame some obstacles, and ended up with a win. Indiana, there's no reason why Indiana can't be in that position against most of the teams on their schedule in any given year, and especially this year, because as you said, it's a really favorable schedule. There's so many aspects of the schedule you're like, in a normal circumstance, we should be looking at this as being kind of a get-well year. We talk a lot about Northwestern and how Northwestern for many years had that kind of boom-bust cycle. Well, a lot of the boom cycles were because the schedule broke for them in a positive way. And what would have been probably a 4 or 5 win team wins 8, 9 games because there's a good culture. Well, at least sort of. I guess we can't say there was a good culture under Patrick Carroll given everything that happened last August, but there was a winning culture, at least, maybe not a good one, and you get things rolling your way. And because football is oftentimes on the margins, if you can increase the team's confidence in themselves and they get some confidence from winning some games early on, that has a huge downstream impact on how you're able to play the rest of the season. And it just feels like Cignetti, and I'll finish up here, it feels like Cignetti and his staff have so completely flipped not just the business-like approach that the team is taking in practices in their own words, but also they are really working to establish a culture of confidence amongst players while also trying to get them to get better at what they do. And I think we have to, clearly we've had plenty of seasons with IU football where we've been overly optimistic for no reason. I think we're doing ourselves a disservice if we're not being optimistic for legitimate reasons, which appear to be there this year.
I agree. As you were talking about, on the margins, I think back to last season. I'm kind of looking through the scores. Where Indiana gets a bad reputation is they have these games, they lose to Maryland 44-17, you lose to Michigan, get stomped by the good teams 52-7. But you look at last year was not a good year, went 3-9, 1-8 in the conference. And I know I'm cherry picking because we could have lost the Akron game, but just you look at how the season ended. We lose at Illinois in overtime, and it's like 48, 44, 45. I forget that game, but we let their quarterback, was it Rocker, starts with an R, just go bananas at the end of the game. You then have Michigan State at home. I remember doing that podcast with Taylor. That was one of the most mismanaged ends of a game I've ever seen. you lose that game by 3, and then you lose to Purdue by 4. You flip all of those. I know it's like, you're keeping the loss, all that, but it's like, those are every year you do look at our schedule and it's like, it is on the margins. Like we haven't been good. We've been bad, but those are all 3 winnable games. If you flip those, that's a 6-win season. You're going to a bowl, and you go back through all of IU history. It is kind of in the margins how bad we've been, and that we're not getting, throttled every single game. Yeah. And so that's something I look at as last year, and I'll take to this year, is like the talent was there. It's just kind of, can you manage things correctly and put it there? I know we have a lot of new players, but that's something where, even as bad as it was last year, to your point on the margins, I was talking to some friends earlier in the week, and she's like, God, is the Big Ten expanding good for IU? Like, where are they going to get their wins? Like, well, there's always going to be those games. Like, the Big Ten has always been tough, but yet when you kind of look at it in a micro lens, there's always 3 or 4 games every year where we have a chance. I mean, hell, we could have won the Penn State game. It's just, that's at Penn State. I'm not going to start adding that into the possible win columns. But, it's never as daunting as it seems when you just think like, oh my God, the Big Ten stack. There's always 2 or 3 games that are there. It's just, we have an ability to seemingly never cash in on any of those games all at the same time in a season.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me because, enough losing happens and you just assume something bad's going to happen. I mean, the whole idea of Chaos Team Indiana, was born out of the idea that Indiana was in a bunch of close games that they lost. And that reputation kind of belies what we're talking about, but it goes to one of the big question marks that I have for coming into this year. And it's been something that I have preliminarily given a lot of credit to Curt Cignetti and his staff on without actually having seen it in person yet, which is this idea that whether it was Kevin Wilson or Tom Allen, or frankly, you could go back through Terry Hepner, you could go back through Cam Cameron. IU has really struggled with getting the basic things done in games, especially towards the end of the game. And that has led to a lot of close losses. It's led to games where Indiana's had talent, but they haven't really been able to put the talent in a box and say, here's the parameters. That has led to a perspective on IU that IU just can't get the job done. And that's generally been true. I am willing to give Cignetti and his staff significant benefit of the doubt, given how good they've been at getting programs up and running quickly and having that kind of parameter within which the players can play and thrive. If they're able to come in and do that here early and they've got some time to scaffold this thing up, because you've got so many new players, I think, and because Cignetti and his staff were largely able to pick and choose what players they wanted to retain from last year, I feel like a lot of the mental and emotional baggage that has often weighed IU down in previous years may not necessarily be there this time around. And if they start winning, if they're executing well, I could see that building on itself. Now, you also have to look at the perspective, we really don't know how good this team is. We don't know how good the offensive line is. We don't know how good the defensive line is. We're not sure how all those things are going to mesh together. It's hard to say, and we talked about this in the podcast I did with Taylor, how bad the offense was last year. Was that a product of the players, or was that a product of the scheme? Now, both of those have changed, so you've got a ton of variables where you're like, I can't really tell how this is going to go. But that's where, when I go into this season, I don't feel constrained by the same level of, I don't want to get overly optimistic about this particular team, because as far as I'm concerned, it's largely a blank slate. And, it's not just the coaches and it's not just the players, but it's also the management superstructure over the program. Now, will we be sitting here in early November and being like, wow, again, you were an idiot? Perhaps. I mean, I say that about myself on a regular basis, regardless of whether I'm talking about football. So, but that's where I think about, as we go through this process and we think about how to evaluate this team and the overall way to feel about it. I don't blame people like you for being ambivalent or uncertain about how much to jump in. But I will say, all the potential is there right now for this to be a really fun season. It's just going to be really fascinating to see how it plays out. I have no idea at this point. All we can do is guess, but that's.
Well, I'm jumped in. I'm not one of the ambivalent.
Oh, there we go.
I'm more on the jumped in side for sure. I mean, I look at 2 other things that, you bring this up a lot, and I'm 100% in agreement with you that there's a real advantage to hiring somebody who has head coaching experience for a job like Indiana. But when you look through, Curt Cignetti's record and just the little bit we've heard, the way he's talked, the way that he conducts himself, I think this is a fair statement. He's never had a losing season anywhere he's been a head coach, and he seems like the kind of guy who doesn't want to start now. It just seems like I think that's something that probably he thinks about, and he's aware of, that he's never had a losing season. You look at, Terry Hepner never had a losing season, although just, a couple years at Miami. He comes here, he does go 4-7 his first year, but you definitely felt the shift change. And again, I go back to the schedule. We'll start doing the game by game here, but I think back to, I think it was one of the Bill Lynch years where I remember looking at the schedule and it's like, we're going to be 4-0 going into that Michigan game when they had Denard Robinson. And it's just like, we were like, that's just the way the schedule broke. And I was like, and I was proud. I called it. I was like, that's going to be a really fun game because Indiana's going to be 4-0. I think that was Ben Chappell was quarterback. It's like, you just knew that was going to be, and it was a great environment. That's the thing where no matter what, unless we're just completely off about what we think is happening, this team will be 3-1 going into that Maryland game. Yep. And that's great. That gets some, it's going to get Cignetti some wins with his players. Because like, look, man, I showed you this is going to win, whether it's against FIU or not, who cares? Like we talked about this all offseason. I told you this is going to work, and now it's working. You're going to get some of that wind behind your sails. But I also think this is where, again, you have, if you're Kevin Wilson or any kind of coordinator coming to a head coach job the first year, it's like, all right, well, I know I'm going to take my lumps and get there. Like Cignetti has a resume he's got to keep up. I don't think he wants his first losing season to be this year.
Yeah. And I'll note this as we go into the game-by-game projections. I'll note that Indiana, according to Pro Football Focus, does not have, the weakest of schedules. Their schedule strength overall is 54th, just largely by virtue of playing in the Big Ten. They are projected to win 6.5 games, despite being ranked 87th in the country in the Pro Football Focus preseason power rankings. So again, I'll note, as we've said, the schedule is actually fairly easy. You might as well just go ahead and be like, all right, let's take that and accept it, not look for ways for Indiana to screw it up. They may still screw it up. It's very possible that if they believe in program DNA, you can't argue that it's not there. But the flip side of it is there may not be There's a lot more opportunities here simply because of how relatively easy the schedule is when you look at just the teams that Indiana's playing and the matchups that they've got.
Yeah, it's funny. I think I talked about this with Zion on our podcast, but I've been playing NCAA football a lot. I just started my Indiana dynasty, which is, one of the last. I get the feel for the game. It's like, all right, now I'm going to take over as Indiana coach. And I think I was up like 21-3 against FIU. And I'm trying some option plays, and I immediately fumble the option. FIU runs it back for a pick six or a touchdown, fumble six. And then next play, it's like, all right, I'll try a different option play. Exact same. There's a quirk in the game where options seem to get, for me at least, maybe I suck at the game. When you're doing an option and I pitch, I seem to fumble a lot. But it's like all of a sudden it's like 21-20 to FIU, and I'm like, oh my God, even the video game has the DNA. I'm like, this is an awful stuff.
I think that may just be that game's having a lot of problems right now. Don't beat yourself up too hard on it. Yes. Yeah. But yeah, no, it is kind of funny trying to think through this stuff and figure out where to put your thought process. But ultimately, the nice thing for Indiana is, we'll know really quickly. If all of this is smoke and mirrors and this team is not good, we're going to know real fast. And that we knew last year relatively quickly, what we were actually dealing with. And so let's talk about what we're dealing with now. Let me go ahead and
say the last thing on that, if, just from before we get into the micro, from a big picture, again, this is why as a program, it's sometimes good just to make a coaching change, because even if things are not great this year, when we go 3-7, we're probably going to find it's something that they, the X's and Joes, they talk about, the tail or the legacy, the years you get, bonus years you get when you change coaches. You and I are going to be unhappy if we go 3-7, but we'll probably see pieces of the change in the DNA or the change in the program. Be like, all right, well, now they've got their feet behind us. Now he's got another year recruiting. Now we can go and push forward and do that. Versus if it's on year 6, 7, and 8 of a regime that has had you start kind of just stacking up, your feelings on top of things. And so I think even if it's not as successful year and we don't get to the win total that maybe you and I are projecting this year, it does feel like the good vibes will, for the most part, kind of keep going for another year. And I think it's an important time because, as you mentioned, all your summer podcasts, we're just at a very unique inflection point with the Big Ten growing, with where college football is. And it feels like this is a resetting of the deck. Not that Indiana is going to become one of those power teams you're talking about, but it does feel like that the cracks are open where teams can kind of move their destiny around a little bit and move their hierarchy. And it would just be a horrible time for us to just continue to kind of suck and not take that opportunity that's available to us to at least move into kind of a solid, middle of the Big Ten type team.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I think that this is where, I mean, especially if you think about how this all sets up for subsequent seasons and just where the program has to go. This is a really critical year, and I don't know that anybody's really thought fully about this, or at least we haven't seen it talked about too much because everything is so new. But I mean, you've got to have some rubber hitting the road here almost immediately because you're going to have to be attractive to recruits. Right. You're going to have to be attractive to your own players. You're going to have to show why this is a place that people would want to come and play football in an increasingly competitive environment with an increasingly uncertain future from a financial perspective about how NIL is going to work and things like that. And so it's just the whole thing to me, there's so much writing on how this year goes, even though it's the first year. I don't think that means that, if they're not good this year, that Cignetti's job is imperiled. It just becomes that much harder. And I think Cignetti realizes that this is one of those, it's almost like a perfect hand that's been dealt to a new coach.
That's a great call. Yeah.
But so you learn, I guess, to some degree, how put together is this coaching staff and how effective are they going to be? Because I don't know that you're going to get a better start to your career than, because you think about Bill Mallory's first year at IU, they went 0-11, but Mallory had almost nothing. That roster was on its third coach in 3 seasons. They had a tough schedule. They were starting from absolute scratch. That was a bad hand. Mallory did the best with it and decided, well, I'm going to fold for a couple of seasons, use that to get better. Cignetti doesn't have to do that because, A, the transfer portal and the ability to bring players in and the fact that a bunch of his good players came with him and they know his system already, that's something that most coaches haven't had at their disposal. He's got the easiest schedule I've seen from Indiana football in maybe ever.
Yeah.
That sounds like hyperbole, but one of the things we've talked about on this show so often is how much IU overschedules its football program historically. And people, they laughed when IU bought that Louisville series out, but imagine starting the season this year at Louisville.
Right.
As opposed to starting it at home versus FIU. I know it wouldn't have quite worked out that way, but that's the kind of the choice that you've got. It's would you rather have that staring you in the face in September or Western Illinois and Charlotte? I know which one I would choose given where IU's program is at. So this is really, you think about what Cignetti's got at his disposal here, it really could be something unique that if you can take advantage of it, it sets you up really well for the next 5 years.
Yep, agreed.
Let's look at what we're talking about. Let me go ahead and get a share screen up as we look at that is next year's schedule. Let's go to this year's schedule. There we go. Okay. So let's start off.
How long can we talk about next year's schedule before somebody checks the podcast?
Right. They've got that
around Evansville. Damn, I thought it was FIU.
I'm really circling that game against Indiana State. Yeah, no, it's we're going to get back to that later. That's funny. Anyway, let's talk about this schedule. So let's start off with FIU. Now, if you look at the Pro Football Focus power rankings, FIU is dead last in FBS. They are ranked as the worst team in the whole conference, the whole division. And look, we've seen Indiana have trouble against teams like FIU, including teams named FIU before. If you go back to, I think it was the 2018 season, they started the year at FIU. They only won 38-28. If you go back to I think it was the 2016 season, they beat FIU 34-13. That one was also on the road. They've had, even that 2015 season, we had some questions. They only beat FIU 36-22. I think it took an interception towards the end to really seal that game. But FIU, not good. I'm not particularly worried about it. the big thing for IU in this, it's like, can they put points on the board? Can they get some play for some of their new players? Can we see some things forming? It's these games are a little tricky in that you almost have to keep it vanilla. You want to give your players some run, but you don't want to show any of your playbook because you want to save that for later on in the season. But this is an easy win, I think, for Indiana. If it's not, then we will redo this entire podcast the day afterwards and act like this one never happened. Scott, what do you think?
I agree. I mean, yes, I'm chalking this one up as a win. I do think that this, if it's close or if it's not a great looking game, I do think, and again, man, I'm trying to not be too positive. I really am a pretty positive guy about this season, but I think how it looks if it's too close is also going to matter. So even if it's like a 21-17 game, if it's like we're trying a lot of stuff but it didn't work, or maybe we had a little bit like just didn't look quite clean, I think that's going to be less concerning than if we look like we're just not sure what we're doing and we're really confused and we're swapping out. If we like swap out quarterbacks or start doing stuff like that, like that's going to concern me versus just like, oh man, I like, it's like, if you could, it's hard to say exactly, like, I see what we're trying to do. We just couldn't quite do it. Just need a little better execution. I think it's better than if we're, not sure what play to call, if we're getting a lot of penalties. Those are the things that are going to concern me. So I still think there's a way you can get out of here with not a great crisp win where you could, kind of look at the best improvement comes from week 1 to week 2. It's not the end of the world, but yeah, this would be, as much as you and I are talking about, getting off on the right foot with this season, there's also kind of the micro of like, let's get off on the right foot with the game. And it would be a real downer if we're in a complete dogfight with FIU and kind of squeak out with a victory. That would be nice. But it's like, if we have a repeat of the Akron game from last year, I'm not sure how confident I'm going to feel about everything, but I just don't see that happening.
Yeah. Moving on to week 2, we've got Western Illinois. Western Illinois is, of course, an FCS team. Last year, Western Illinois went 0-11 overall, 0-8 in their conference, and they were not a good team. They didn't just go 0-11. They lost a bunch of games by a bunch of points. They lost 48-7 to Missouri State. They lost 52-7 to North Dakota State. They lost 63-0 to Southern Illinois. They lost 50-6 to UNI. They lost 48-7. I mean, they played some pretty good teams, but they lost. I mean, Indiana State was really bad last year, and they lost to Indiana State 27-6. So, again, this is one of those games where you want to get some run for your younger players. You want to try to figure out some more chemistry between your players. But this is a game Indiana should win handily. Yes, I know they haven't always done that in these games, but I think this will be another acid test for IU. They have failed to blow out teams like this more often than I think we would care to accept. And I think it's an important measuring stick because beating a team by a huge margin but not showing a lot of your playbook kind of demonstrates with the physical and overall qualities of your team. I think this has got to be one of those. So again, I think it's an easy win. I just would like it to be a large win because I think you need that cushion mentally to say, wow, we really can blow teams out if we play at our best. And I think this is probably the first time that you could 100% count on that being a possibility.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned, what Western Illinois looked like last year. So for any IU fans out there after that game, if you're getting crap from your friends about like, oh man, those are really, really bad. It's a bad team that's also really bad. It's like, who cares? Right. Because like in 2007, we went, to the Insight Bowl, the first bowl in years. We played Indiana State, Western Michigan, and Akron. I have no idea how good or bad those teams were going into the year. I just know we got the wins. So it's like, that's all that matters for real programs. I do think the thing that'll be interesting, you're talking about, can you win big without showing your playbook? The key is you want to just win those 2 games. And I have them both chalked up to wins. We would be super pessimistic for I think they're 1-1 going into UCLA. I think you have to assume they're 2-0 going to the West Coast. But it will be interesting from a fan perspective if they come out and they are super vanilla, doing a lot of runs right up the middle like we saw in the Allen era. Even if they win, I think I'm going to be like, man, I really hope there's more to the playbook than this. Like, I hope that we're just holding all of it back for UCLA and the Big Ten, because that would be a slight concerning feel, is if you don't see anything dynamic from the offense and they still win. It's like, I really hope they're holding it back. I don't think we're going to see that, but that's the only thing. But again, that's winning is the most important part. How the fans vibe with the offense is way down the list for Cignetti. It's a thought experiment of like, if you keep it that vanilla, you really better be holding something back, or else I hope we don't see that same kind of offense again. Because if we do, we're going to have a bad year.
Yeah, I mean, last year it was interesting with James Madison because the first game they had was Bucknell, who's also a non-FBS team. They won 38-3. It's like that's fine. Yeah. Okay, if you win by that margin and your defense just shuts them down, that's all right. And and that led into that big win that James Madison had against Virginia, going into that second game of the year, the one they won on the road, and that really set them up for what they did down the rest of their time. I mean That team last year had 3 road games to start the season after that Bucknell game, at Virginia, at Troy, at Utah State. They won those games by 1 point, 2 points, and 7 points. But, that's what you hope for, is like, can you get some momentum? And as Cignetti has mentioned in several of his press conferences, winning kind of breeds winning, and the winning mentality breeds more winning in the mentality. So getting these 2 relatively weak opponents early on, winning those games, that's such a key part of the alchemy that has to happen with this. So that
I was going to I kind of want to keep this going for the beginning 5 or 6 games of the year.
Yeah.
What do you think the fan turnout and vibe is going to be like in the stadium for those first 2 games? And I want to talk about it going into the Charlotte, Maryland, Nebraska games. I'm curious your feeling on what's the fans going to be like. What are the students going to be like? Like how do you see Memorial Stadium definitely this Saturday and then next Friday?
I mean, I think attendance will be good. The FI. I mean, neither of these are huge draws by themselves, but you do have the excitement of a new coach, and I think people are legitimately very interested in this team. For FCS level opponents, we have generally seen Indiana drawing approximately 43,000 people. I think for a Friday night game, you may have a slightly lower attendance because you've got high school football going on during that period. For the Saturday game against FIU, I think it could be 40, 48, 49,000. I think there's legitimate interest and excitement in this team. I don't think it's going to be to the point where you're selling out games against non-premier opponents, but you always get a nice boost that first week of the season. When you go back and look at some of the first week opponents Indiana's had and the attendance that has been there, like, Illinois, which was a Saturday night game a couple of years ago. I mean, the reported attendance there was 44,357, and then they got 46,000 against Idaho, although that was that game where it rained a bunch in the second half. That general level, I think, is what I would look at for these first couple of games, largely just because I think people are going to be excited enough and interested enough in what goes on with this team that they'd like to see it in person, and maybe that ends up positively affecting attendance later on in September.
Yep.
So anyway, Indiana hits the road for the first time in the season the next week, as they will be playing at UCLA in the Rose Bowl. Scott, this is a game that a lot of people have had circled on their calendars, and I think it's a fascinating game in that UCLA is a team that I don't think anybody really knows how to exactly judge them. It's a team that was set up largely for Chip Kelly. He recruited them. He was struggling. A real lack of NIL in terms of bringing players in, and that seems to have continued in this offseason. They do have some good residual players. They have one of the most brutal schedules in college football, like 3rd hardest schedule in college football this year, according to Pro Football Focus. And it's one of those games where if you look at it from the UCLA perspective, like here's their opening games that they're playing. They go to Hawaii on the 31st of August. They have a bye. They get Indiana at home. And then their next 3 games are at LSU, Oregon at home, and at Penn State. So UCLA is circling this game as a must-win on their schedule, because if they don't win this game, like there's a real good chance that they're going to be like 1-4 if they win at Hawaii, going into playing Minnesota at home on the 12th of October. New coach in Deshaun Foster, and an unproven one at that, and a weird kind of timing thing for UCLA, because not that football is particularly that important at UCLA to begin with, but their students won't even be back because they're on like the quarter system, much like Northwestern. They start later on. So an already generally empty Rose Bowl will be even emptier by their standards. A lot of IU fans are going to be there. And I think IU, after hopefully 2 wins against lower level competition, will look at this as their first real game of the year. They'll be throwing the kitchen sink at it. I really like Indiana in this game, Scott, and maybe I'll be proven wrong by that, but it's hard to look at UCLA in what they've done over the course of the past few years and really get excited about them as a program. You know, I mean, you look at last year, yes, they won 7 games in the regular season, but of the 7 games that they won, yes, they get credit for beating USC. The rest of the games they won were Coastal Carolina, San Diego State, North Carolina Central, Washington State, Stanford, and Colorado. Not a lot of really top-level wins among that group of teams. So, you know, for me, I think this is like Kurt Cignetti's got to be circling this game and saying, this is going to be our signature early season win. Like, we want to go on the road, take on a team that is probably worse than they were last year. And that maybe sets us up for, you know, people really paying attention to IU for the first time. So I kind of like the vibe Indiana would have going into this one. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
I also like the idea of us just like handing off the we're good at basketball, but we suck at football vibe in the Big Ten to UCLA. Because you look at their schedule, as you mentioned, here's their Big Ten schedule. This is like the schedule that we always get, taking our game out of it. Oregon, at Penn State, Minnesota, at Rutgers, at Nebraska, Iowa, at Washington, USC. And then the ultimate topper is like, oh, and throw in a road trip to LSU, which is like the ultimate like overscheduling. It's like, this is primed to become, this is what IU normally does, is like have this gauntlet of a Big Ten schedule. It's like, we'll just throw in a non-conference that we shouldn't be throwing in. You know, you talked about this at some point this summer, you know, I think with Taylor about, you know, why Indiana is so low ranked in all of the projections in football. And it's just because, you know, if you're a national columnist, you're obviously going to look at Ohio State, Michigan, Iowa, maybe. Like, you're just not going to do a deep dive on all schools. And so there's some schools you just kind of just shorthand, like, all right, well, this is where they're normally at. And I feel like that's why you're getting UCLA ranked ahead of Indiana. I don't think it's based on, I think it's based on just UCLA is normally better than Indiana has been. As I look at this game, and I look at the schedule, I think there's 2 really winnable road games in the Big Ten schedule this year. I think it's this game, and I think it's at Michigan State. So to me, I kind of look at it like I don't see us winning both of those. Which one do I think is more winnable? And it does feel like this is where we could catch a team napping, you know, not totally ready for what Indiana has. I could also see Cignetti holding a lot back and kind of throwing it at this game. I also think, and I talked about this in a couple of the previews, you know, UCLA doesn't have a history of drawing huge football crowds. This is the first time Indiana is playing on the West Coast in a game that really matters. And, you know, LA has a very large Indiana alumni base, close to Chicago, or close to the numbers of Chicago, close to the numbers of New York. And we've seen when the team is really energized, you and I were at the Gator Bowl, like we were drawing close to Tennessee numbers. Like, Indiana fans will travel. You and I are both going to this game. I know a lot of people are going to be going to this game, and there's a good alumni base in LA. All that said, I think the Indiana fan contingent is not going to be bigger than UCLA, but I think it's going to be way more than probably what UCLA is expecting. All of those things said, I am with you. I think this is a game that Indiana wins and picks up, and I think Cignetti also just kind of looks at this schedule. It's like, all right, if we win this, there's a real path to being 4, 5, 6-0. Right. Let's make that happen. And so I am like you, optimistic. I think this is a win. And Indiana's 3-0, 1-0 in the Big Ten.
Yeah, you know, and the other thing I'll say on this before we move on is that UCLA is counting this as a win. Like their punditry is like, well, you know, and look,
sucks. Welcome to the Big Ten. Yeah,
and I get it. I mean, Indiana's in FPI. I think Indiana's like in the like 77th or something like that. In Pro Football Focus, Indiana's in the 80s. The projections have UCLA somewhere between 30 and 50 spots better than Indiana in all the power rankings. And I will be the first to admit that if you're just going off of those, UCLA will probably not only be favored, but will be favored by double-digit points. I don't know that anything is going to happen in the first few weeks to change that, which actually I think maybe if Indiana has their stuff together, that actually might play into their hands. So we'll see what happens. I mean,
but also I think like look at the way that each of the coach, and probably doesn't mean anything, but how each of these head coaches comported themselves during a Big Ten media day. Like we've already won that. So which coaching staff are you more comfortable in based on their media day? The way they handle that, I would say IU.
I am truly, yes, winning the press conference has always worked out so well for IU, but no, your point is well taken. Charlotte, the 49ers, they were 3-9 last year. They are, I think, 121st in Pro Football Focus. Their 3 wins last year were against FCS opponent South Carolina State. They won at East Carolina, who is an FBS opponent, and then they won at Tulsa. But they lost a bunch of other games throughout the course of the year. They did not score particularly well. They averaged 17.5 points a game. This will almost certainly be a noon kick on BTN. This should be a game that Indiana...
We call it the IU spot.
The IU spot, yes. This should be a game Indiana is able to come in and win relatively handily. And at this point, I think maybe less concerned about keeping the playbook under wraps. This game's been on the schedule for a while. Charlotte will have already played at North Carolina. They'll have played James Madison in the first game of the season. So that'll be, I'm sure, some interesting watching for Curt Cignetti and his staff that came from there. But this is a game, again, Indiana should win. And if they win this and our projections are simpatico with the reality, they would be 4-0 at the end of the day on the 21st of September, which it's been a while since that happened, Scott.
Yeah, I do love, it shows, time TBA, TV TBA. It should just be time ... Like, it's going to be noon BTN. Like, come on, IU fans, this. Even if you have to be kind of really pessimistic, and you and I have seen a lot of bad football. I feel like at times we've been close to being broken by IU football. You have to be really broken if you're not at least suggesting IU is 3-1 leaving this game. Like if you're expecting that, you're just not in on what you've seen out of Cignetti this offseason. And again, you and I have said this, like, obviously it's all just offseason stuff. It's winning the press conference, but that's all there is right now. So, and empirically it's been awesome. Like the offseason has been awesome. That may lead to nothing in the season, but if you come out of this offseason and being like, man, I'm not sure I feel where they're going, I'm not sure I agree with how you view off seasons. Because yes, they won it, may not mean to anything during the season, but this is what a new coach is supposed to do. It's exactly everything you're supposed to do. And so it's like I said, if you're saying, I think we're gonna be 2-2 going into Maryland, I was like, I need to see your work. Like my son's doing math now. It's like, please show me your work. The Indiana's going to win this game. At worst, they're 3-1, but like you and I both think they are going to be 4-0 going into that Maryland game, which again, we will continue to say this, but the schedule is like, this is where, I'm just going to kind of keep moving us a little bit, with Maryland. Yep. This is, as Big Ten teams go, it feels like a lot of times we get these little runs, like that year I mentioned where we went 4-0, and then it's like, oh, but you're playing Michigan at home in a very tough game with Denard Robinson, slightly down Michigan. It's like, it's still Michigan. Normally at this point in the schedule is where we see, we're going to Iowa, or we have Ohio State here, or we're playing Penn State. It's like, this is a team in Maryland that you and I have always been talking about. Like, this is kind of where we need to be. This is the level waters, the team. It's right where we're at. They've lost some things on offense. As schedules go, this is the most winnable Big Ten game you're going to find with the chance to go 5-0. And as I look at it, Maryland has as many question marks as we do. They have a little more recent success. So I think that's why they're getting the ranking that we are getting. So I look at this as, I think at this point too, you now have had 3 home games. You've had people to say, hey man, this team is kind of fun to watch. In our reality, it's like, hey man, they went and won a Big Ten game. Like they've already won a road game.
Right.
And if you're a fan, you can kind of see like, holy shit. Like we win this game, we're going to Northwestern next. That's like, you could see 6-0 and your bye week very clearly. I think this could be one of the first large crowds we see in the Cignetti era this season. So I think it's going to be a fun atmosphere, and I think we win that game.
I'm with you. I mean, the big question mark for Maryland is ultimately what is going on with them at quarterback. They had Tulia Tagovailoa is gone finally. He entered the Jess Settles, Evan Eschmeyer wing of the Big Ten as guys who just never left.
They should have a show on the Big Ten Network, just like we never left and we don't.
Never left. I love it.
We're still here.
It's like BTN, the journey that never ended. Yes, it's like the Lord of the Rings with some of these guys. But Tagovailoa being gone means that they're either going to have last year's backup quarterback or they're going to have a guy from North Carolina State. Like those are their two options right now.
Are they doing the Tom Allen move or they're not naming a quarterback? We just don't know.
If they've named one, it didn't happen by the time the article that I'm reading about them was named. But look, Maryland, they've got talent. Mike Locksley has done a good job of accruing talent there. And look, Maryland, over the course of their time here under Locksley, has been better than I think the perception may be here. You know, from going past the COVID year, they kind of did what we thought Indiana was going to do. They became a team that regularly won enough games to get to bowls. They were 7-6 in 2021. They were 8-5 in 2022. They were 8-5 again last year. And they were clearly better than Indiana by a significant margin last year, winning 44-17 at home. And, you know, I think if you look at the delta between where Indiana needs to be and where Indiana is at, that was the game that really, to me, crystallized how far away Indiana was, as far as their team was concerned. This year, I mean, the thing about Maryland last year that was interesting and really over the course of the last three seasons is they've won a lot of these games despite not scoring an overwhelming amount of points. They've been under 30 points per game in every one of those three seasons. Last year, they were really unpredictable. They had certain games where they played really well, and then they would turn around and they lost to Illinois at home in a game that was a surprise. They lost at Northwestern in a game that they probably shouldn't have lost. But then they turn around, they beat Nebraska at Nebraska. They beat Rutgers pretty handily, and that Rutgers team was pretty good. They beat Auburn by a really large margin in the bowl game. So how much of that is embedded in the program now versus how much of that was Tagovailoa is going to be a really interesting question, because Tagovailoa last year, 66% completion, 25 touchdowns, 11 interceptions, threw for 3,300 yards. I mean, that's a huge amount of production to lose. Normally, Indiana's close to Maryland. I feel like Indiana's got enough impact transfers that are coming in. I think they win this game. And I think it's going to be one of those games again where maybe Indiana's coming in with a bit of a head of steam with the way that their season has started. Maryland, we're going to know a lot about by this point because they will have played UConn, Michigan State, traveled to Virginia, and then they'll have Villanova at home in the previous week. So they'll have played competition that's kind of in the same ballpark of where Indiana's starting. And I think we'll have a pretty good sense of whether we're being wildly optimistic. I will say this, if Maryland can get past their first 5 games, their schedule sets up really well. They've got to go to Oregon and go to Penn State, but the rest of their games are really winnable. Indiana, they're going to look at this and say, gosh, if we win at Indiana, we could go
7-0, yeah.
We could go 7-0 to start the season. And so it's going to be a tough game, but I think given the home field advantage Indiana will hopefully have by that point, and given some confidence, I like the chances of Indiana to win in this game. I think it'll be a tight one, but I think Indiana comes away with the victory. I think my score projection on this game was 31-24. I think it's going to be a game where it's like a touchdown either way.
Yep, I agree.
All right, last game of the opening salvo at Northwestern. Scott, I don't know about you, but I'm tired of hearing about how Northwestern is playing in a tiny stadium by the lakefront. I really don't think it's pertinent. I don't understand why people are making such a big deal out of it that. And that seems to have dominated the conversation, and people are just assuming, Northwestern's going to be
pissed at it. You were so pissed at it.
I'm not pissed at it. I'm just pissed that it's become this Northwestern. It's do we really care about where they're playing? Is this that cool? It's going to be an odd thing. I mean, you talked with Connor Onion about this a little bit on your podcast. It is certainly a unique vantage point, but at the end of the day, it's not that big of a deal. And it's going to be, I think, actually more of a problem for Northwestern than a problem for their opposition, in that it doesn't look like it's going to be much of a home field advantage. The crowds are going to be very small. And I mean, you're looking at crowds that are smaller than a lot of high school games in Texas and Georgia at this point, the way that it's set up.
Yeah, no, I mean, well, Connor Onion was like, he was there for a couple practices and he's like, the wind's going to be a problem. And he was thinking there's a chance that, or he's excited there's a chance a punt could go in the lake, which again, like we're talking about this in 2024 about Big Ten games where punts could go out of the field and play into a lake. I just don't know how it's going to affect the team. If wind really is whipping around there and we have a more dynamic passing offense, you wonder how that's going to affect it. Or how it's going to affect Indiana. You know, you look at Northwestern going into this game, you know, they're coming off of a road trip at Washington. They have kind of early games after that. They play us and then they're going to Maryland. I think this, you know, the beginning part of the season, to me, it's what's interesting about this season and the way it lays out is, you know, if you believe in this team like you and I seem to do and believe in the changes they've made, you're going to have to believe early because the games that are kind of toss-ups are all early, which is nice, but it's, you know, I think Indiana's going to win this game, but this is the part of the Indiana fan legacy that's there. It's like, all right, I take a step back and we're now 6-0 in my projections with 2 road games in the Big Ten. And I always joke, like once you start chalking up wins and you start getting Indiana, that like, we're going to get that one, we're going to get that one. Like it never, ever works that way. Now, maybe one year it will. And this is the soft meat of the schedule. So you have to get it done. That's the only thing that's holding me back. But I think empirically, if I believe what I'm hearing and the little bit we're seeing out of practice with Cignetti and this team, I think we are a better team than UCLA, Maryland, and Northwestern. I just think we are, based on the fact that we're getting Maryland at home. That's the difference. And to me, it's like the Northwestern game, this is a non-factor field, so it's not like this is a hard road atmosphere. And again, if IU's 5-0, we've always done really well getting tickets for Northwestern basketball, getting IU to fill the stand. So it's possible Indiana has a good fan contingent. So there's real reason I believe we're going to be 6-0. It's just that Indiana fan part of me, like I don't know if you and I have ever projected a 6-0 start in the history of this podcast. So I'm a little nervous doing it, but sure. I do think going into the break, we will be 6-0.
Yeah, I'm with you. I mean, I actually feel more confident in Indiana winning this game than I do about the UCLA or Maryland games because Northwestern they won 8 games last year, but they were not an 8-win team last year from a statistical perspective. And look, sometimes you have seasons like that. Sometimes everything breaks your way. And I think what's important to keep in mind is you look at last year, that season could easily have gone off the rails for Northwestern in a number of different ways. And it kind of did at the beginning. You know, I mean, they lost to Rutgers handily. They lost at Duke, but they had several games where they made all the right plays and their opponents didn't. They beat Minnesota at home. They beat Maryland at home. They caught Wisconsin at exactly the wrong time where Wisconsin was falling apart. Indiana beat Wisconsin in that same stretch last year. They beat a Purdue team that had no business losing to them, and yet they lost to them. And then they won at Illinois, but we saw how flaky that Illinois team was last year. So it's like, you know, this is a team that almost lost at home to Howard. They only beat Howard by 3. And a lot of their games were won despite the fact they didn't score hardly at all. They only averaged 22 points a game. Their opponents averaged more throughout the course of the season. They were real bad in most offensive areas, and yet they won 8 games. And so I think what's important to keep in mind when you're trying to evaluate IU versus Northwestern is I just think Northwestern's, like their projections for win totals this year are 4.5. Indiana's projection for win total is 6.7. That's just with statistics, and that's taking into account that we haven't really gotten a good sense of what Indiana is going to do on the field. I like Indiana's chances in this one quite a bit, and I don't think the stadium plays that much into it. So I'm also with you. I'm just like, okay, 6-0, already bowl eligible, kind of frightening. And like you said, we've never projected that before. But I'll say this, even if we're off by one of these games and Indiana's 5-1 at this point in the season, that's amazing. Like a 5-1 start going into the bye.
And what's wild is like even the most negative, you're probably 4-2,
right?
Even 3-3 going into a bye. But no, I'm just saying, like, even that would be not great, but even that's not, you know, we've kind of always been in this spot where it's like even 3-3 going into a bye where you have a couple of winnable games left on the schedule. I don't feel like we've had that in recent history, but I'm with you. I think 6-0 is very realistic, but you almost feel like the floor going in is 4-2 or 5-1.
So then there's the bye week, which Indiana will use hopefully to get better and rest up a little bit. Then you get into a really fascinating 4-game set in this schedule. And it starts off with homecoming, Indiana taking on Nebraska, who for the 20th year in a row, we've all been told this will be the year that Nebraska is breaking through, right?
By the way, I'm just on the schedule you have here. Could they just list every time possible? It's like it could be a noon, 3:30 or 7:30 game. It's like, yeah, no kidding. Like it could it be on, you want to throw down all the networks? It could be on too.
It's
again, this is the year Nebraska is it's like, this is the year we're gonna make fetch work. Like we're gonna make it happen. This is the year. Just get ready. But you look at how they finished last year. They lost 4 games in a row. They lost to that Wisconsin team that was kind of reeling. They lost to Maryland. They lost at Michigan State. They lost to Iowa when Iowa just couldn't score. Nebraska found a way to go the under and only get 10 points. Their wins last year were against Northwestern, Purdue, Illinois. They barely, they got that one, and that's it. So it's not like they have this great resume of history coming in, and every year, like you said, they feel like they are the paper tiger. And Indiana's actually played Nebraska pretty well the last couple of years. It's not like it's a team that has blown our doors off when they've beaten us.
I really want to pick Indiana in this game.
I know.
I really do. I don't think I'm going to. Now, here's why. As much as I say I'm not going to get afraid of picking IU to win games, I am trying to factor in the likelihood that there's going to be at least a game, if not a couple of games, that Indiana could win that they don't. And Nebraska is just a fascinating case. Like, I just trashed Northwestern's offense last year. And then you look at Nebraska, and Nebraska averaged 4 points per game less than Northwestern did last year. Nebraska, their passing game last year was only better than 2 teams in all of FBS. Would you like to guess which 2 teams were worse than Nebraska in passing?
FIU?
No, FIU was better.
Charlotte. Let's go off a bad team in our schedule.
It's one of them, which is hilarious, is Iowa, because of course.
Yes,
but the other one is Army, a team that doesn't throw the ball.
Yeah.
Like so this is where you're and the thing with Nebraska, the idea is, they've gotten better, and yet the guy that they're going to be relying on this year to make their offense better is a true freshman quarterback. Now he's a 5-star. Dylan Raiola is his name. He's a 5-star player. Everybody's got the great things to say about him. He's clearly very talented. But how many true freshman quarterbacks have we seen come into the Big Ten and really be able to not just handle running in an offense, avoiding getting hurt, but also how many have stepped in at the lead of a program that has 90,000 people in the stands desperate for wins every week? That's a huge amount of pressure for a kid that, as the Pro Football Focus article noted, just went to his senior prom like 3 months ago.
Yeah. I mean, the thing they'll have is they will probably or very likely be, 5-1 going into that Indiana game, or they could also be 6-0. It kind of depends on that Colorado game, which is probably the ultimate, the ultimate bowl of teams that are all hype. Like, Colorado, Nebraska, who's real? One of them's going to get a win. They'll be 5-1 or 6-0, and that also concerns me a little bit, as they'll be feeling their sea legs a little bit. And right. I'm like you. I think they leave this game 6-1.
Right.
But I'm also not like you. I could see them winning this, but I can't envision a world where Indiana's 7-0. So maybe they lose UCLA, but they win this. Like, I think there's a combination. I've already picked 6-0 up to this point, so I'm going to pick a loss. But I think that you could have a loss. The Maryland, Northwestern, UCLA triumvirate. One of those could be a loss, and you can win this game. I would say 6-0 after this game. Sorry, 6-1. But part of it is, again, with this schedule, there's, it's not out of the realm of possibility we're 7-0.
Right. You move on to Washington the next week. By the way, I'm also picking a loss. I'm picking a loss in the Nebraska game. And it's, again, my gut says pick a win. But I just feel like one way or another, they're probably going into this game or leaving this game 6-1 like you. And I wouldn't be shocked if Nebraska, because Nebraska's got talent. The thing is, like, Nebraska certainly has talent. It's just a big question mark on offense. Will they have enough time to get things fixed? And can they beat Indiana, who, while I think Indiana is much better this year, they're on a different echelon talent-wise than Nebraska has. It's just a matter of, can Nebraska harness it? I think they do by the time this starts.
Real quick, just quick side, new segment, Fever Dream Scott. We win that Nebraska game. We are 7-0. We have a win against Nebraska. We won 2 road games. We're looking at our schedule as we still have Michigan State and Purdue. We have Washington the next week, who we're not sure about. We're 7-0 in the, going into the late stages of October. Just give me what's Memorial Stadium like going into that Washington game? What's your tailgate like? Like what are we looking? I mean, we're literally like, are we going to make the college football playoff? Like it's bananas if we are 7-0, which is wild. Like, this is the only time we ever get to this point is when we're like, somehow we beat Ohio State. Maybe they don't show up and they forfeit a game. Like, there's a non-zero chance we're 7-0. Just fever dream with me for a second, because it's all possible now.
And no, we might as well, let's just lean into the car crash. I think it's the best of ideas. But no, I've thought about that a little bit. Griffin Gonzalez, who is, of course, the field mic voice for Memorial Stadium, is convinced that this scenario that you're laying out is actually going to happen. I've been trying to temper his expectations a little bit. But look, I think in the world where Nebraska is just the same mid-Nebraska program that we've come to know and love over the last 15 years, and Indiana wins that game and now they're 7-0, to me, I mean, the vibe will be insane, like to the point that I think if Washington takes care of business, you could have a 7-0 Indiana versus a 7-0 Washington team going into that game in Memorial Stadium on the 26th. That could be a college game day game, like or a big noon Saturday game. Like there's a real chance of that having a really high profile, matchup for these two teams. It's hard to get your head wrapped around it, but this is what I said at the beginning. It's like if the cards fall, and I don't even think that you're going out of the realm of logic,
right?
To say, it sounds stupid to say, well, Indiana could be 7-0 going into playing Washington at home. But the flip side of it is, if you take it game by game, please highlight where the stupidity is coming from. Like, the stupidest projection we would have here would be Indiana beats a questionable UCLA team on the road, or they beat a likely for regression candidate Northwestern team on the road, or they beat a Nebraska team that averaged under 20 points per game and has a true freshman quarterback at home on homecoming. Like, please point out the crazy, and I'll be happy to acknowledge it.
With that is, if that's the scenario, it's like we have 5 games left. 3 of them are at home. One of our road games is at Michigan State.
Yeah.
We don't know what we're going to see, but I doubt they're also going to be in the 8-0 conversation. So it's like there's a world where you're like, hey, I mean, again, this is between Nebraska and Washington. It's like, if we are 7-0, I mean, then it's like, all right, at that point, in reality, I think Washington at Michigan State and Purdue are all possible wins. It's like, I'm seeing a 10, there's a possibility at that point in time to be like, holy shit, are we 10-2? Like, it's a wild thought process. But like you said, it's not, whenever we do this and kind of have the Scott fever dream, it's always based on, could we get one of these it's our turn to finally beat Michigan. And that's what's going to get us to this point. None of those have happened up to this point in our schedule. These are all realistic games that we could theoretically win. I don't know, it's fun to think about right there, but in our scenario, we're not. We'll fever dream out. We're 6-1.
Yeah. And so in this Washington game, Washington's a really fascinating case because, yes, Washington was in the national title game last year.
Right. They're all gone.
And they're all gone. All 11 starters are gone. The head coach is gone. A lot of the staff is gone.
The conference is gone.
So, I love in Pro Football Focus, in their capsule on Washington, the closing paragraph says, it's rare for a program to go from making a national title game to potentially going 500 the following season, but that's the situation Washington finds itself in. And
that's kind of the history of Washington. Like, they have these huge ups, then it's just like they go back to the middle for a while.
Yeah. And, keep in mind that they're bringing in their starting quarterback this year is going to be Will Rogers, who we saw at Mississippi State for 4 years. And
quotes. Oh, sorry, it's Roy Rogers. That's
just right. But he's okay. I mean, he's been really good as a quarterback, but that was under Mike Leach, and he's probably not that guy anymore. And Jed Fish, I think, is clearly a good coach. What he did at Arizona was really impressive. That's a tough place to win. But again, Washington is not one of the big dogs in terms of college football where they can just reload. I mean, they had a perfect storm of Kalen DeBoer fully blossoming as a head coach, Michael Penix having 2 injury-free seasons. And, keep in mind, like they got really lucky along the way. They were good, but they got really lucky along the way in a lot of games they played last year. A lot of people view this game as a game too far. I'm going to put this down as a loss because I would trust a team that's been to the national title game and has a coach with a winning pedigree at the FBS level and a quarterback who's got multiple years in the SEC. I just think that combination, on paper, you'd be hard-pressed to say that's a team that's going to be worse than Indiana at this stage of the season. So I'll put it down as a loss, but I think Indiana will be very competitive in that game, and I wouldn't be shocked if they won.
The thing is, it's not only do you have a new coach, Washington has kind of been going through coaches really quickly. You had Chris Peterson from 2014 to 2019, but then you go to Jimmy Lake. You have a 3-game Bob Gregory experiment. You have Kalen DeBoer, who was very successful. It's only 2 years. Now you have Jed Fish. There's a lot of instability there. Kalen DeBoer is a fantastic coach, as we all know, and as everything you mentioned, had a lot of things break his way. But you do wonder, too. You see programs like this that have that high. It's not good when you're looking at, basically 4 coaches in 5 or 6 years. It's a lot of change. You do wonder if that's going to catch up to you at some point, that you've basically had wholesale coaching staff changes 4 times in a 5 or 6 year span. So I do wonder about that. I think there's a lot of reason to believe that Indiana could win this game. And I'm going to pick a loss just because I think the institutional, skill of what Washington has is just a little bit higher than Indiana over the years. And I also think, Indiana is also, we have a new coaching staff change. We're bringing in some new players, but you have years, the last 2 or 3 years, as you and I have mentioned, it looks like our team is not up to snuff with the same level of talent. And so I think that's going to catch up to you at some of these games. And so I think it's a loss too. But, this is where the vibes, these 2 games are so interesting to me, is I could see us splitting these just on also our teams kind of go in the right direction and the vibes are going the right way. And this team really feels like they're out against the world. And I don't think either of these games in and of themselves are off the realm of possibility. There's a crazier fever dream on a fever dream. We're 8-0. I don't think that. I think it's going to be a loss here. I think we'll be 6-2 coming out of this game.
I'll say this: both these games to me, Nebraska and Washington, I think the big test for Indiana. Again, we're just projecting. This is 2 months away, but it feels like where both of those teams might have a big advantage over Indiana is in how good their defenses are and making it hard on Indiana to score. And I think that both will need that, because I don't think that either of those teams' offenses are going to necessarily be any better than Indiana's. But the question is, I mean, the unsung hero for Washington last year was, their defense was able to do a lot of things that kept them in games and put them in good spots. It was not the most dominant, defense on the planet in terms of they allowed 24 points a game, but they kept they were able to score so much in those games. And I think their defense is going to be better this year. It'll compensate for their lack of offense. The question is, how much offense are they going to be lacking? I mean, we know from personal experience, the drop-off from healthy Michael Penix and Kalen DeBoer calling plays to the next option can be devastating for a program. Washington's looking at this and saying, well, God, we were great 2 years in a row. The previous year we went 11-2. We went to the national title game last year. That's the big question mark, but it's almost impossible to know. I feel like this is one of the bigger question mark teams in the whole conference right now.
Agreed.
So, anyway, the last 2 games in this stretch at Michigan State.
Another question. It's wild. Almost every Big Ten team on our schedule is a question mark. I agree with you. Washington is the ultimate question mark. Michigan State as well. It's like they're coming on with a new coach. The only thing I will say for Michigan State that I look at, this is the end of a brutal stretch. They are getting a new coach. That always comes with some toughness, some tough getting into. But their stretch before this, they are hosting Ohio State. They go at Oregon, come back to host Iowa, and then go at Michigan. That's probably an 0-4 stretch, probably with some serious beatings in there. Not to mention they're at Boston College and at Maryland before that. So I'm not sure how those games go for them. This could be a reeling Michigan State team when we get to them at the beginning of November.
Yeah, I mean, so Michigan State, they have been such a dumpster fire the last few years that it's hard to get your head wrapped around. I mean, they were, I believe, the lowest scoring offense in the whole conference last year. They had one of the worst passing attacks in the whole conference. They threw for under 2,400 yards, which is shocking. And they just had several games where they no-showed on offense. I mean, the most points they scored against a Power 5 opponent last year were against Indiana, when they won 24-21. But as we talked about, like, that game should not have gone down the way that it went down. And if you look at the other games that they played in the conference, they scored, I guess they scored 24 points against Rutgers too, but they lost that game, which is kind of my point. Indiana failed to capitalize. They've got a brand new coach in Jonathan Smith, who was at Oregon State. They've got a brand new quarterback who was also at Oregon State. Aiden Childs is his name. They have 23 transfers. So much like Indiana, it's a brand new team. But their defense was real bad last year. I think they finished outside the top 100 in overall grading and an EPA per play, and then their three best defenders entered the transfer portal. And obviously sometimes you lose bad players off of bad defenses. You get better because you've got better players filling in. But I just kind of look at it from the perspective of, there's no reason why, if Indiana's rolling at that point, that Indiana wouldn't be able to beat Michigan State. Michigan State might be okay this year, but as you said, I mean, they have clearly scheduled for a bad year. Their schedule is Florida Atlantic, Prairie View, and Boston College. That's their non-conference. But by this point, they will have, as you said, they'll play Ohio State, at Oregon, Iowa, at Michigan, and then they've got Indiana at home. That's going to be a beat-up team. And Indiana has won at Spartan Stadium in memory. It's not like that is a place where Indiana
casting when it happened. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So I don't think Indiana, they won't look at this as being a game that they have no chance of winning. And I do question, like, for this first year for Jonathan Smith, as he's trying to get things going, I think he'll be fine at Michigan State, but it's a lot of changeover. And there were much more deep-seated cultural issues at Michigan State than I think everybody really realized. So I think Indiana wins this game. I think that the talent levels are more or less, they're very similar at this point between these two teams. And Michigan State by this point might have been at a state where they're like, we're not going to accomplish anything this season. We're mailing it in the rest of the way. Whereas Indiana might have some significant hope going into a game like this that they can carry on.
Yeah, I originally, when I was looking at the schedule and previewing for this, I thought at UCLA and at Michigan State, we were going to go we're going to win one of those. Which one do I think we're going to win? And I picked UCLA just on the idea of, we're going to catch them early. It'll be hopefully good weather, kind of a nice game. And who knows what you're going to get at Michigan State in November. And, maybe there's some, residual feeling of going to an original Big Ten stadium and having trouble there. But the more you and I have talked about it, and the more I looked at it, and I really looked at that schedule, that Ohio State at Oregon, Iowa at Michigan run. Indiana fans, we've been there. We've had those 4-game runs where you just get your teeth kicked in week after week. And maybe you play pretty, you have one game where it's like, man, we were close against Iowa. If these 8 things would have happened, maybe we would have won. We've been there. And normally, the Michigan State's going to look at the rest of their schedule. It's like, all right, we're 3 of the next 4 at home. Indiana at Illinois, Purdue, and Rutgers. Those are all winnable. But as an Indiana fan who's been through those stretches, you never come out and that next game look really good. It's like you almost need a game to kind of get your sea legs. Like, all right, whoa, we're not playing a number 3 team in the country. Like, we can actually do some stuff. I think Michigan State might struggle in that. So I flip this to a win. I see this as a win. I also think, if you look at the schedule for Indiana, you have Nebraska, Washington, Michigan State, Michigan, Ohio State coming up after this. I don't see Cignetti going 6-0 and then 0-6. I think that would be a weird dynamic.
We called that the 2015 around these parts.
Yeah. Yeah, and then just eke your way into a win against Purdue. So I think for all the reasons you mentioned, the schedule, I put this as a win as well. So that makes Indiana, 7-2, which is still, I mean, we're wrong. Like, I've got to be wrong because that's not possible with Indiana football coming off of what we're come off of.
Tell me where to donate the testicle for that. That's
the last time we were this optimistic was going into that Iowa game, and it was over in the first 12 seconds.
Before we get to the last games of the schedule, we wanted to have a brief mention from one of our sponsors, Hoosier Game Day Lager, brought to you by Upland Brewing Company. Hoosier Game Day Lager, for those of you watching on YouTube, we have the beautiful candy striped can. Upland really knocked it out of the ballpark with the Game Day Lager here, a Vienna Lager, which the closest flavor that you've probably had, maybe it's like a Sam Adams or something like that. It's a lot more complex of a flavor for Hoosier Game Day Lager than your typical adjunct lagers or light beers that you'll get at most games. Hoosier Game Day Lager, the perfect beer for tailgating, the perfect beer for watching IU football on your couch. And Scott, I'm really excited about the fact that Hoosier Game Day Lager is available all across the stadium and has been for the last couple of years. You can watch it while you're watching Indiana in these games that we're talking about, playing against Nebraska, playing against Washington. A crisp beer, a really easy drinking lager, and overall one of my favorites to bring to tailgates. You can pick up Hoosier Game Day Lager at any place that beer is sold, including Upland's many locations across central Indiana and in Bloomington. Be sure to pick up a case of Hoosier Game Day Lager for the upcoming football season.
They have some of my favorite. Like, they have a wheat beer that's awesome. They have a Two Tarts, which I'm not a huge tart beer guy. I love their Two Tarts. But the thing is, as I'm looking at this can on the picture, it's like, it is one of those where, you see it and then it's like, yes, of course there should be a beer can with candy stripes. Like, it looks so awesome. It's like, how did it take us this long to get? Everyone's at IU games. They've been pitching the candy stripe stuff for probably 10 or 12 years now, putting candy stripes on everything. People are drinking beers before the game. Like, how did it take this long? Give it up, for coming up with this idea. But just, you look at this can, it's like, this should have happened 25 years ago. But we are living in the now. We're living in a world with AI. We're living in a world where Indiana could be 7-2, and you could be drinking a Game Day Lager with a beautiful striped can at maybe at Galen's tailgate.
Yeah,
maybe just do a full Upland Lager, Game Day Lager setup for one of your tailgates.
You could even bring some Hoosier Game Day Lager to the tailgate as a peace offering.
That's a good piece. Any tailgate, really. You bring some. Just maybe it's Galen, maybe it's not. It'd be a good peace offering for anybody.
Anyway, Hoosier Game Day Lager, the first official branded beer for IU athletics, and we hope you enjoy it throughout the course of this season. All right, let's get back to the schedule. The game at home against Michigan on the 9th of
This feels normal. This feels like an Indiana football schedule. All right.
Yeah, we're back. We're back, baby. We got Michigan and Ohio State in back-to-back games. Look, Michigan is going to be an interesting team this year. I think they're a regression candidate. Some people think they're still going to be really good. It's hard to say for sure, but I do think that as much as we've talked about the importance of culture, there'll certainly be some residuals from the Harbaugh culture, but who knows with the new head coach, especially a relatively inexperienced one like Sharon Moore.
Will he coach this game, or will he be suspended? Do we know?
That's a great question. It's with Michigan, suspension is always likely, regardless of who's playing or coaching. But I do think, again, just from a talent comparative perspective, this is probably going to be a tough one. I do think Indiana could be an interesting competitor to Michigan in this game, though, because ultimately Michigan, again, will also be coming off the game at home against Oregon. They'll have already played at Washington. They'll certainly be loading up for the Ohio State game that's a couple of weeks afterwards. I think this is a loss for Indiana, but I wouldn't be shocked if Indiana kept it somewhat competitive. And I think this is the type of game that you'd like to see Indiana just look like they're supposed to be on the same field as Michigan. And I feel like hopefully by this point, especially if, according to our projections, Indiana's like 7-2 in this game, they might have some confidence that they've otherwise lacked in a game like this. But I still think they'll probably lose the game.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think Michigan could be a regression candidate. You look at Michigan over the years, and I've done it on this podcast, I think they kind of get lumped in with the high-level elite teams like Ohio State, but really they're much more kind of high mid, and then they reload and have a good year and then come back down, unlike an Ohio State that is just banging out, 10-win seasons, 11-win seasons, all 5-star recruits just keep on bringing in guys. Michigan really is a level below that, and their history says that everything kind of went well for them last year, all pieces put together. They won a national championship. They haven't shown the ability to do that year in, year out, like the Georgias, like the Alabamas. So I'm with you, but I think even at a regression, they're better than Indiana. And you're getting into fanciful thinking if you're like, all right, this is where Indiana's going to rattle off. I don't think it's completely out of the realm of possibility. I'm not going to pick them to win. But with 7, maybe 8 wins at this point, that should be a really fun atmosphere. But the thing is, really fun atmosphere does not make a tough atmosphere for a team like Michigan to play in. They've played in hostile environments. Even a hyped up Memorial Stadium really isn't going to freak out a team like Michigan. So I don't think you're going to have a lot of that. It'll be fun. It'll be exciting, but I don't see us beating Michigan. I don't think that's a bad thing. Spoiler alert, I don't think we're going to go into the horseshoe and win either. I don't think either of these are a bellwether of anything. Even if we lose and it's not super competitive, I don't think it means anything. But yeah, I think we're losing to Michigan.
Yeah, the one thing, much like I talked about with Washington and Nebraska, I think the defense is very good for Michigan, and that'll probably carry them through. But as you can note, they lost their starting quarterback. They lost their starting running back. They lost their top 6 offensive linemen. They've had a lot of loss on the offensive side. They always lose great players, and they always replace them with great players. So I'm not expecting a lot there. Another bye for Indiana. I do like the double byes. That's helpful. Then they travel to Ohio State, who at that point will be well on their way, I think, to a Big Ten title. Probably will already have it sewn up, or at least an appearance in the Big Ten title game. I do think that at some point Indiana will give Ohio State like a real run for their money again, as they did in the Tom Allen and Kevin Wilson eras. I don't think this is the year for that. And this is the last game that Ohio State has before they head into a game that they have to win against Michigan.
No kidding.
So I don't think they're going to be screwing around in this one. I think that they'll be locked in at this time of season. So any other thoughts on that one?
No, it feels like Ohio State's on a revenge tour, and Indiana's. We're not anybody they care about, but they're just out to firebomb probably everyone in the Big Ten. They have to win that Michigan game. And it's a wild. They could win every other game this year, and if they lose to Michigan, unless they win the national championship, there's a world where I could see Ryan Day getting fired. Like you can't continue to lose to Michigan. I'm with you. I don't see them screwing around in any game. I just see them coming out and trying to take care of business. That is the Death Star of the Big Ten. They have everything. They really reload every single year. We might get them. It'll probably have to be a Memorial Stadium. So I don't have a world where we're beating Ohio State at Ohio State.
So as we move on to the last game of the year, it's Purdue. And Purdue bucket game, Memorial Stadium. It's hard to know for sure what's going on, but Purdue is really not projected to be a particularly good football team this year. They do have a projected win total of 6.2 according to Pro Football Focus, but the public is very down on Purdue. Their win total is only 4.5. It's an interesting thing because Purdue probably should not have been as bad as they were last year, just going off of the roster. And I think you do have to ask the question. It's kind of a make or break year for Ryan Walters. Purdue is a tough place to win. It's maybe not as tough historically as Indiana to win, but over the course of the last 15, 20 years, they've had some really low lows. And I do think it's reasonable to ask, Jeff Brom leaves and, suddenly you go from an 8-6 team as they were in 2022 to a 4-8 team. And, outside of a couple of unicorn games that they had last year, the game at Virginia Tech, the game at home against Illinois where they just blew Illinois out, and the game at home against Minnesota, they were pretty bad. They lost against all of the mid-level opponents they played. The one exception was Indiana, and Indiana even played them really close in that ending game. And that was Indiana.
It was dead man walking.
That Indiana team was done. They were toast at that point, and they still almost won that game. And so I just, Purdue, I feel like this game, if there's 2 games that Kurt Signetti's probably got scheduled or circled on the schedule, I think one of them is that UCLA game, the first game of the year, and one of them is this game. Obviously, he's been talking about, we're looking at every game the same. We're not overemphasizing the bucket game, which I love. I love that. But the flip side of it is I do think that this is, you circle this game because this is one of those games when you look at the schedule and you try to rate like what are the most likely games that Indiana would win. This might be the game that Indiana, you would have to circle and say, well, if they're going to have a successful season, this is like a no-brainer. They have to win this game in the Big Ten. So it feels like everything kind of adds up for them. And if Indiana's had a good season, they go into this one with the potential to win their 8th game of the year. I like their chances of doing so in this one because I think that they will be ahead of wherever Purdue is at. I have a hard time envisioning this Purdue team putting it together. And again, it's a team that does not have a very favorable schedule. Purdue will have had to travel to Oregon State, travel to Wisconsin, travel to Illinois, travel to Ohio State, travel to Michigan State, and then their home games are Notre Dame, Nebraska, Oregon, Northwestern, and Penn State. That is a brutal schedule, Scott. I mean, maybe you look at the Northwestern game at home and say, hey, we're going to win that one. I'm not sure where the other likely wins come from for Purdue. So again, a team that could probably or possibly see the wheels come off early on.
Yeah, no, I think this is a game where, Indiana is going to be playing for something. I don't think Purdue is. I don't think there's a world where Purdue's playing for 6 wins here, just based on their schedule. It's at Indiana. And some of that doesn't matter. There's been a lot of years where Indiana's playing for nothing, Purdue's playing for something, and then Indiana plays them very tight. I think it's going to be a close game. But everything that you've seen with Cignetti, the way he played at James Madison, and also what you've seen just the way he talks and the way he carries himself, it doesn't feel like the team is going to be scared, and they're going to be understanding. Like, we're playing at that point, you're playing for, in our reality, 8 wins. They could be playing for 7 wins, 9 wins. Maybe they're trying to get to 6 if things haven't gone as well. But I think unless you're looking at the worst case scenario, this game is going to mean a lot for Indiana. This is probably going to mean either are you going to get bowl eligible if the season hasn't gone well, you're at 5 wins. But I think at this point, it's like, all right, we're now playing for seeding in what kind of bowl we're going to get. We want to end the season off well. And like you said, I'm happy we're getting off of the what have you done to beat Purdue today, but it is still it's still a rivalry game. It'll be at home. It's the last chance these fans can send off this team. And if the way the season goes that I think it's going to go, I think you're going to have some real positive inertia because you will have had 2 bad games against Michigan and Ohio State, but everything else should have hopefully been close to possible wins. So I also think this is going to be a win. I also just think Indiana's in a better place. They have a little more of an identity. If, again, what we expect to see under Cignetti happens, it's a team that will have an identity at this point, will have kind of a feel for what they're going to do. Whereas a Purdue team could be really reeling and maybe kind of checked out. We saw it last year. Allen's team was checked out. They almost won, but they didn't. Right. Like that's the thing is teams that are checked out kind of do that. Like they put up a couple punches and they can't get it done. So I think they win. And oddly enough, you and I are exactly the same. We have the exact same win-loss, and we have Indiana at 8-4, which, if anybody who's not an Indiana fan just checked into this podcast and looked at the last couple of years of Indiana and what we've done, and the one time we had any expectations, we completely S the bed. You would say this is insane. Why are you picking a team to go 8-4 that hasn't won more than 4 games in a couple of years? But as you said, man, you look at game to game, I don't think we're being illogical. And I just continue to go back to it's a really soft schedule. There's nothing wrong with it. It just is. And capitalize on it because it's possible. And Northwestern does it the years they have it there. The year Illinois went to the, college football playoff, they had a soft schedule, or the BCS, whatever it was in 2003. It's like this can happen. Good things can happen to middling teams at times when the schedule breaks right and they actually take care of business.
Yeah, that's kind of where I've landed with it as well. I mean, does 8-4 seem crazy in a vacuum? Yeah, but that's why you don't pick games in vacuums. Right. You got to look at, and again, a lot of it's a projection. A lot of it is, but I think about the 2019 season a lot when I think about these. Like nobody was picking Indiana to go 8-4 going, through that regular season at the beginning of the year. And the way that season started, you would have been like, well, gosh, they barely beat Ball State. They blew out Eastern Illinois, and then they got annihilated by Ohio State. but the big question marks in that season, like how are they going to fare against Rutgers? Would they be able to beat Maryland? Would they be able to beat Nebraska? How would they fare against a Northwestern team?
Road games back to back.
Right. And that they won all of those, and they were competitive against Penn State. They beat Purdue in a big game at the end of the year. That team, I don't think anybody expected really great things out of them, but things fell properly. And as it turned out, Rutgers wasn't very good that year. Maryland wasn't great that year. Nebraska was, again, not great that year. Northwestern was much worse than people thought. And it just feels like when you look at this schedule and you look at the impact.
All the teams are on it again.
I know. Well, and Signetti has brought in the right types of transfers. And you look at his track record, and it's like, I don't see why that couldn't work at this level. So, yeah, we both pick 8-4 for the regular season, and yeah, you could say, well, gosh, that's just you guys being optimistic, which if you're saying that, you've clearly never listened to the podcast. But the individual games, I think, just add up to that. And I actually feel like I may have shorted Indiana a potential victory or two if
I agree.
Indiana's rolling and the teams that they're playing are not. But I feel good about 8-4. I think 7-5 is absolutely in the realm of possibility. So much is just going to depend on how quickly Indiana can get up and out of the gates with this new group of personnel. But I like the group of personnel that they've got, and I like the coaching staff that they got, and I like how all those things are kind of coalescing right now.
8-4, given off what we said, where do you put us in a bowl projection there? Where do you think we're at?
You know what? The thing is, I have no damn clue anymore what the ties and affiliations are. I mean, if you look at the Big Ten's bowl ties right now,
is it a shrug emoji? Just like, nah, I don't know.
I mean, so it looks like Indiana. How about this? I will project right now that Indiana will be 8-4. Let's say, you know what? I think they go to the Music City Bowl. How about that?
Okay.
I think that would make some sense. But a lot of it's so hard to project these things anymore because the other issue is that there's the Pac-12 schools are still using the Pac-12 bowl ties. So it's almost like when you figure Oregon will be a contender for the playoff.
Who's the third team? What do they do for the third team tie?
I don't know. I'm really not sure. But apparently, like the Alamo, Independence, Holiday, Los Angeles, Las Vegas, and Sun Bowls are all games where if Washington is bowl eligible or USC's bowl eligible but not in the playoff, they would go to those, not the Big Ten bowl ties. So the Citrus Bowl, the ReliaQuest Bowl, the Duke's Mayo Bowl this year, the Pinstripe Bowl, the Guaranteed Rate Bowl, like all of those will stay with the Big Ten teams. And then the question becomes, well, who's Indiana competing against if they're 8-4 for those bowl tie-ins? I don't really know the answer. I don't think anybody does. But I do believe like Indiana has had.
It sounds like this is a sport with no one in charge, Galen.
It really does. Yes, it really does. But it does feel like Indiana, if you're looking at the other teams that might be bowl eligible and you think about where they would like to place teams, Indiana's had a long-standing almost date with the Music City Bowl.
Yeah.
And that is where I look at it and I say to myself, well, that would make a lot of sense. You'd play like a mid-level SEC team. It could be a lot of fun. You'd get a lot of people that would drive down there. But again, it's like with 8 wins, I think you're absolutely in that territory, maybe slightly higher. Maybe you're in the Duke's Mayo Bowl conversation. Who knows at this point? But that's where I've landed at this stage.
Yeah. No, and it feels it's wild to say after what the last couple of years we've had, but it feels like if we don't make a bowl this year, it's going to be a disappointment. And I don't want to start getting negative here, but you look at the schedule, you look at the way Signetti has attacked the offseason, you feel like that's got to work out. It would be really frustrating to see this team come out and make a lot of the same mistakes we've seen year in, year out, look undisciplined, unable to close games, and go, 4-8. Even though that would be an improvement over the last couple of years, or even 5-7, win-wise, it wouldn't be the end of the world, but it would just be frustrating because, again, you look at the schedule next year, it's not set up as nicely as it is this year. There's probably going to be a regression. So it would suck to have the regression come off a 5-7 season, not an 8-4 season.
Yeah, look, and ultimately, who knows what the future holds with a lot of this stuff. But yeah. I think like you said, I mean, the way Indiana is basically tried to schedule for at least the next couple of years in the non-conference. It's okay. Let's just get the 3 wins. Like next year, the non-conference is Old Dominion, Kennesaw State, and Indiana State. And then, all right, can you scrape together 3 wins in the conference and then maybe get lucky with a 4th win? And now suddenly you're in the 7-win category instead of the 6. The following year, the schedule is odd. They get, there's only 2 non-conference games currently on the schedule. I didn't even notice this one had been added. They're playing Colorado State at home in the opening game of the season in 2026. Who knew? But the idea, I think that the scheduling philosophy is different, and it is what we've been asking for a while, which is why kill yourself in the non-conference? Because as you said at the beginning of the show, nobody remembers who you beat. All they remember is that you won enough games to get into a bowl, and that's, I think, where Indiana is. If they can capitalize this year, they really set themselves up to be a destination for recruits and transfers, where it's like, okay, Indiana's in the ballpark in NIL. It's a place I can go and be on television and maybe get to a bowl, 2 out of 3 years, or maybe 3 out of 3 years. And that's where Indiana has to be. You've got to get that floor before you can raise the ceiling.
Yeah. And I just playing fever dream one more time, but 8-4 is a good year. There's a chance you go 9-3. We saw it with Indiana's 2020 season. When they got going, they got a lot of buzz. It was really interesting, but it showed that there is some staying power to that. I mean, it came in the next season ranked. We completely pissed all of that away, but it does feel in a weird way with how much the landscape has changed since that season. Everything is kind of etch-a-sketched, has changed. It again feels like there's an opportunity here for us to change our standing in the Big Ten. If we can have that year that you and I have talked about, even if we can go 6-0 or 7-0 and have kind of a marquee game, maybe we don't win it, but just show up as like, hey, this is a program that feels like it's on the rise and is able to take it and continue to grow it. It really does feel like there is some opportunity here for us to change our station, especially when you look around the Big Ten. And it always is this way, but you look around the Big Ten and, the teams that are at your level, whether it be Michigan State or Maryland, or maybe even Washington or UCLA, they all seem to have question marks, and not all of them are going to go, arrow pointing up. And so why not be the team out of all of those to kind of look like, all right, well, this is, Michigan, Ohio State, Penn State, Oregon, they are in a different strata. Why not be the next level of team that's kind of in that high mid-level team? It does feel like the opportunity to take that is there. Maybe it doesn't stay year in, year out, but it does feel like you could have those moments where you kind of become a horrible analogy, but like, what Colorado was last year for a bit of the season within the Big Ten, to kind of be like, wow, Indiana's really something. Like they're putting some, because again, we're 6-0. Very few people are going to go in and dig into the schedule and be like, well, they didn't play it. It's just like, you're 6-0 and you're playing a 6-0 team. It's like, that's a big game. Game day is going to be there.
We'll see what happens. It's going to be a fascinating year, and we are excited.
Excited. Tailgate update? Are you going to tailgate in first game?
Yep, we'll be there. Tailgate, and the lot's open at 9 a.m., and I guess I'll be out there at 9 a.m. It'll be a long day because the game doesn't kick off till 3:30 in the afternoon, so this might be one of our patented breakfast and then lunch tailgates where we've got 2 different things of meals, but we'll have the TV set up. We'll watch some college football. We'll go in and watch Indiana play in that first game against Florida International. I'm looking forward to it.
Me too.
So should be a lot of fun. We hope you folks have a lot of fun throughout the course of the season. We look forward to talking with you throughout about Indiana football and what's going on. And should be a lot of fascinating things happening in Curt Cignetti's first year. For Scott, I just played the wrong music. Wow.
We're starting again. All right, let's look at
over. Well, we probably need to. We went 1 hour and 48 in this podcast. Anyway, for Scott, I'm Galen. Thank you for joining us here on the show. We will catch you throughout the course of the season. Be sure to tune in for both of our football podcasts every week. We might have more than 2. We'll see. For the whole Back Home Network, I'm Galen Clavio. Thanks for joining us here on the show. Bring back the Bison. We'll catch you folks on the flip side. So long, everybody.